Without that.
I got a bad sore throat, so I'm trying to avoid talking loudly, but I'm not sure this is going to work. All right. One quick announcement. I got some emails from several of you requesting that I put maps that I've been referring to and using in PowerPoint on Moodle. I've done that. If you go to the Moodle course page, and you look up at the top near where the syllabus is, there's a folder that says maps. Click on it, and some of the most useful, I think, maps that I've been referring to in the PowerPoint presentations are there and available for you.
Yay.
Remember, next Wednesday, next Wednesday, the exam on Fools Pro. Next Friday, the exam on lecture material. All right, today I will lecture on the federal government's dispossessing land from Montana Indian tribes between 1865 and 1890. So I'm sure the federal government pressuring, coercing, whatever verb you want to use, Native Americans to cede or give up some of its land is a story in American history that you're familiar with. In Montana, that took place primarily between 1865 and 1890. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. The federal government pressing, pressuring, coercing, forcing Montana Indian tribes to give up some of its land and to relocate on smaller and smaller and smaller reservations. In its details, this is a very intricate and complex history, and yet I now have 46 minutes to go over it with you. What that means is we're going to have to rely on some generalizations, and I'm not going to be able to detail what happened with every tribe or how each of the reservations that currently exist in Montana were created. Rather, what I'll do is I'll use two tribes as examples to show what the general process was. But before we get on to that story of how did the federal government dispossess Montana tribes of land during this period, let me make a few general points that are relevant to what I'll be talking about today. During the period that I'm focusing on today, 1865 to 1890, federal Indian policies directly and profoundly affected Montana Indians. I point this out as a way of relating it to what we've already talked about so far in this class. We've already talked about how climatic and environmental changes affected Montana Indians. We've talked already about how European settlements in North America affected Montana Indians. Remember, during the Century of Transformation. More recently, we talked about how the fur trade affected Montana Indians. For this period, roughly the last third of the 19th century, it was federal Indian policies that most profoundly affected Montana Indians. Not the only thing that shaped the history of Montana Indians during this period, but I would argue it's what most profoundly affected the history of Montana Indians during this period. The primary goal of federal Indian policies during this period was to concentrate Montana Indians onto reservations, meaning onto smaller land domains, and thereby open up land that had previously been controlled by Native Americans for American settlement and American economic use. Does that make sense? Why did the federal government during this period in time dispossess Montana tribes of land? Because Americans wanted access to the natural wealth that was located on that land. They wanted access to the gold and other precious metals. They wanted access to the valuable grasslands for ranching. They wanted access to fertile soil for farming. They wanted access to trees for timber. All of these things are valuable economic commodities. Gold, silver, later copper. Grasslands, fertile soil, timber, all valuable economic commodities that Americans wanted access to, but they were located on Indian lands. And so how do you open up those natural resources for use by Americans? You force Native Americans to cede or to give up that land. And for Native Americans, what was at stake were a variety of things, but sort of most immediately, access to their traditional hunting grounds and the animals and the foodstuffs located on that land. Why? And so, in some ways, in one way, to understand the nature of the interaction between Americans and Montana Indians during this period of time is as a conflict or a contestation over accessing natural resources. Americans wanted access to those valuable economic commodities that I just listed. Montana Indians wanted access to the bison, to other game animals, and to other foodstuffs located on the land. And before delving into the process by which the federal government dispossessed Montana tribes of land, let me give you a little bit of background. Let me sort of set the context in the 1860s. This picks up with my last lecture on the gold rush. This is a map you should all be familiar with by now. Recall that the treaties of the 1850s that I lectured on, I think, 2 class periods ago, those treaties from the 1850s were agreed upon before Americans saw value in the land of central and eastern Montana. So the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and the Blackfeet Treaty of 1855 were agreed upon before Americans saw value to central and eastern Montana. And so, those treaties left Montana Indians, the Plains tribes of Montana, in possession of all of the lands in central and eastern Montana. The discovery of gold, the discovery of large deposits of gold in the early 1860s altered Americans' perception of the land. After gold was discovered, Americans all of a sudden saw value to the land and thereby wanted the land. The gold discoveries occurred in this area, the common hunting ground. And so early in the 1860s, as you know from last lecture, thousands of non-Indians poured into this area right here. There's Virginia City, over here was Bannock, up here is Helena, here is Butte. Lands within the common hunting ground. By the mid-1860s, American settlements began to encroach upon land that was designated as tribal lands. So by the mid-1860s, Americans were encroaching out of the common hunting ground up into this area. It was controlled by the Blackfeet, into this area controlled by the Crow. Not surprisingly, the Crow, and especially the Blackfeet and also the Gros Ventres, objected to these intrusions. And periodic instances of violence occurred. Or you can simplify that by saying episodic violence. Back and forth between Americans and Native Americans. And so, Native Americans might raid a settlement of Americans or raid a ranch. Ranches were being developed in this area. And steal livestock. Or in some instances, kill American settlers. American settlers would kill Native Americans. And so during the mid-1860s, there developed this back and forth of episodic violence. Not wholesale warfare or widespread warfare. That didn't happen in Montana. There wasn't war between Americans and, say, the Blackfeet. Rather, it was instances of back and forth violence. You read about this in Fool's Crow. Now, Fool's Crow is set in the late 1860s, but think about the examples of back and forth violence that you've read about in Fool's Crow. That's precisely what I'm talking about. Now, in response to this violence, and in particular in response to Native American raids on Americans, the federal government built forts in Montana territory. The purpose of these forts was to protect American settlements, protect American settlers. The two most important forts that were built during this period of time were Fort Shaw and Fort Ellis. You definitely want to get Fort Shaw and Fort Ellis in your notes. Both Fort Shaw and Fort Ellis were built in 1867. There's another map you all are familiar with and is accessible on the Moodle page. So, Fort Shaw, again, built in 1867, was located at the Sun River crossing of the Mullen Road. Right about there. Just to the west of present-day Great Falls. Now, this was a strategically important point because it was on the Mullen Road. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Mullen Road. It was an important wagon trail, overland route between Fort Benton in Montana Territory and Fort Walla Walla in Washington. It came right through the Missoula Valley. And so this was an important transportation route from the Missouri into Washington Territory. Fort Shaw was built for two primary reasons. One, to protect the people and the goods being transported along the Mullen Road, primarily from attacks from the Blackfeet, and to protect the American settlements on the northern edge of the mining frontier. And so remember, here's Fort Shaw. Americans by this time were developing ranches and homesteads in this area. It was to protect those northern settlements from attack by the Piegan Blackfeet. At the time, 400 troops were garrisoned at Fort Shaw. Fort Ellis was the second important fort built by the military, by the federal government in 1867, and it was located at the strategic porthole of the Bozeman Pass, right about there, obviously near present-day Bozeman. It was intended to protect the mining settlements in southwest Montana from attacks by the Sioux Indians and potentially from attacks by the Crow Indians. Here's a photo from the time of Fort Ellis. But geographically, the point to make about both Fort Ellis and Fort Shaw is that here's the American settlements in the area, right? There's Fort Shaw, protecting the American settlements from an attack by the Blackfeet in the north. Here's Fort Ellis, protecting the American settlements from a potential attack from the east. This was the purpose of the forts. Now, ultimately, the forts did curb some of the violence. After the forts were in place and the military established its presence at both forts, that episodic conflict that I described did decline. But, and this is a key point, the forts did not solve the underlying problem that caused the conflict. What was the underlying problem? Americans encroaching upon Native American lands, and the Native Americans trying to prevent them from doing so. It didn't solve that basic problem. In fact, what it did is use the military force of the United States government to protect the American settlers who had illegally settled on Indian lands. In other words, the federal government did not live up to its treaty obligation. What was its treaty obligations in those 1850s treaties? To protect Native Americans from encroachments by American citizens. The federal government didn't live up to that treaty obligation. Instead, it chose to protect the American settlers who were settling on Indian lands. At the same time that the federal government established the forts to protect American settlers, it also began to force tribes to cede land that Americans wanted access to. So it was basically a two-pronged approach by the federal government. One, establish a military presence that would protect American settlers and intimidate Native Americans. The second pronged approach was to then approach them through treaty agreements and executive orders to get them to give up that land so that the Americans could have it now legally. One more point to make before I talk about this process of dispossession. A critical event, and in some ways the turning point in the relationship between the Piegan Blackfeet and the United States government occurred in 1870. And it's generally known as the Baker Massacre, but you'll also sometimes see it referred to as the Marias River Massacre. And so this heading in your note should be the Baker Massacre. It occurred, as I'll describe, January 23rd, 1870. Now the Baker Massacre is described towards the end of Fool's Crow. So if you've made it far enough into Fool's Crow, you've read Welch's description of the Baker Massacre, the Marias River Massacre. Now, the account that Welch gives you in Fool's Crow is in general historically accurate, but he does fictionalize some of the details. But in its general outline, what he presents is historically accurate. But because he fictionalizes some of the details, let me give you kind of a historically non-fiction account of the Baker Massacre. Now, the immediate events that led up to the massacre began in 1869, when a group of young Piegan Blackfeet killed a well-known American settler named Malcolm Clark. Clark lived near Helena and was a well-known American settler in the area. There are varying explanations as to why the young Blackfeet killed Clark. The most likely explanation is it was a family squabble, that Clark was married to a Piegan Blackfeet woman, and that this was kind of a family squabble, family revenge. There's also some other explanations as well. In other words, it wasn't a random act of violence. Other American settlers in the area demanded that the killers be brought to justice. And so federal authorities issued arrest warrants for the Piegan Blackfeet that killed Malcolm Clark. But the killers didn't turn themselves in, they wouldn't turn themselves in, and a band of Blackfeet, led by Mountain Chief, essentially protected them and hid them. At this point, the U.S. Army general in charge of this area, a man named Philip Sheridan, who some of you may be familiar with, decided that this was the moment to end Indian attacks on Americans in Montana. And so he issued orders to Eugene Baker, who was a major and the head of the 2nd Cavalry stationed at Fort Ellis. Major Eugene Baker, head of the 2nd Cavalry stationed at Fort Ellis. He instructed Baker to find Mountain Chief's band and, quote, strike them hard, unquote. And so, the 2nd Cavalry, led by Major Baker, went out in search of Mountain Chief's band. On January 23rd, 1870, Baker and the 2nd Cavalry came upon an unsuspecting Blackfeet encampment upon the Marias River. Right about there. A reportedly drunk Baker gave orders for his men to attack the encampment, which they did, killing 173 people, including 53 women and children. So the attack killed 173 people, including 53 women and children. Here is a photograph of where the massacre took place. Now, this mass killing was unconscionable enough, but Baker had made a tragic mistake. He attacked the wrong band of Blackfeet. It was not Mountain Chief's band that he attacked that morning. It was rather the band of Blackfeet led by Heavy Runner. Heavy Runner had very good relations with Americans at the time. And in fact, when the shooting began, Heavy Runner reportedly exited his lodge and held up in an attempt to show the troops a statement that was signed by the local Indian agent attesting to the fact that Heavy Runner and his band had good, friendly relations with Americans. Guess what? His body was riddled with bullets. The Baker Massacre stands as one of the worst atrocities in the fighting that occurred between the United States and Native Americans in the West during this period of time. The only other real comparable atrocity is the Sand Creek Massacre that had occurred earlier in Colorado. This is one of the worst atrocities in the fighting between Native Americans and the United States during this period of time. In addition to the deaths, which is obviously significant, the historical significance of the Baker Massacre is that it effectively broke the back of Blackfeet resistance to American settlement and effectively intimidated the Blackfeet from aggressively resisting future demands that the Americans would make upon them. I mean, this killing was a graphic and deadly display of the power that the United States could bear upon the Blackfeet, and it effectively broke their resistance to American settlement. Yeah.
Did any of Baker's men die?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, what happened was that many of the men were out away from the encampment. And so the encampment had sort of relatively few adult warriors that were there. But I'm not aware of any deaths. All that I've talked about so far provides us with the context now for understanding the process by which the federal government dispossessed Montana's Plains tribes of land between 1865 and 1890. Now recall that the Pend Oreille and the Kootenai had already been relocated to the Flathead Reservation beginning in 1855. Recall also that the Salish Indians were located down in the Bitterroot Valley as of 1855. But the Plains tribes in Montana had not been forced onto reservations. In the 1851 or 1855 treaties, they continued to control all the land of central and eastern Montana. Now, the two tribes that I'll focus on are the Blackfeet and the Crow. And I'll take you through several examples of their land being dispossessed, starting with the Blackfeet. So, as of 1855, this was the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventres land domain. 1855, that was Blackfeet and Gros Ventres land. In 1865 and 1868, I know there's lots of dates, statistics, but this is the only way to really make sense of it. In 1865 and 1868, the federal government insisted that the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventres give up the southern part of their land domain. And so in 1865 and 1868, federal negotiators agreed with the Gros Ventres and the Blackfeet to two treaties, the 1865 treaty and the 1868 treaty. Effectively, what was taken away from the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventres was the land from the Musselshell River up to the Teton River and the Missouri River. So this is the land that was ceded to the United States in the 1865 and 1868 treaties. The reason why the federal government sought to take that land away from the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventres is because American ranching companies wanted access to the lush grasslands in that area. I'll talk more about this in Friday's lecture. In return, the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventre were supposed to get $50,000 worth of supplies and goods every year over 20 years. So $50,000 annually in useful goods and provisions for 20 years. But guess what happened? The United States Senate did not ratify either of those two treaties. Those treaties were negotiated, they go back to the Senate, they were never ratified. Even though they were never ratified, Americans began to move onto those lands anyway. And so, even though the treaties weren't ratified, the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventre nonetheless effectively lost control of that territory because Americans moved onto the land anyway. Then, in 1873, this is after the Baker Massacre, recognized, President Ulysses S. Grant issued an executive order. By 1873, the federal government was no longer making treaties with Native American tribes. Rather, at this time, the executive branch, the president, was issuing executive orders. So in 1873, President Ulysses S. Grant issued an executive order which designated most of northern Montana as a large reservation for the Blackfeet, the Gros Ventre, the Assiniboine, and some Sioux tribes. Some Sioux bands. So in 1873, Ulysses S. Grant issues an executive order designating northern Montana as a reservation for the Blackfeet, the Gros Ventre, the Assiniboine, and some Sioux bands. Now the boundary of that reservation, as established in 1873, was the Missouri River down to the Sun River. So from the Sun River north and the Missouri River north, this was to be the reservation for the 4 tribes I identified. A year later, however, in 1874, Ulysses S. Grant issued another executive order, redrawing the boundary of that reservation from the Sun River up to Marias River, meaning that the 1874 executive order effectively took away this land from the Blackfeet. There was no compensation given to the Blackfeet for that land. Now, the result of these 2 executive orders was to essentially legalize the never ratified 1865 and 1868 treaties. Essentially, it was to make legal what had already happened in practice, which was Americans had moved into that land and had effectively taken control of it, even though the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventre had never officially given it up. These were 2 early important land cessions between the Blackfeet and the U.S. Yeah, question?
In the 1868 treaties, were Blackfeet ever compensated for that land?
They got initial sort of gifts, but they didn't get the annuities that were spread out over the 20 years because it wasn't ratified. They got initial sort of provisions and gifts, but not the provisions year after year after year as assigned in the treaties. But that's not all. Later, in 1887, the federal government essentially forced upon the Blackfeet another major land cession. In 1887, the federal government essentially forced the Blackfeet to give up their eastern land domain, 17.5 million acres of their eastern lands. And it's this land sort of around the Sweetgrass Hills here. So that was effectively taken from the Blackfeet in 1887, 17.5 million acres. Then, in 1895, the federal government convinced the Blackfeet to sell much of the land that would become Glacier National Park. Much of the land that is Glacier National Park, the United States convinced the Blackfeet to sell to it in 1895. Yeah. You know, I might as well make this point now. I was going to make it later on, but I've talked in this lecture and in the lecture about the 1850s treaties about how the agreements were that tribes gave up some of their land or gave up other considerations to the federal government, and in return they got the annuities, these annual payments of useful goods and provisions. Much of that useful goods and provisions never made it to Native Americans. Much of what the federal government was supposed to provide for tribes never made it. And it's useful to know that.
Isn't that where the phrase, when you make an agreement, you don't go through it from the Indian trades?
I don't know if that is the origins of that phrase. But it's important to recognize that much of what Native Americans were supposed to get in these annuities, they didn't receive. They got some of it, but certainly not all of it. And so, by 1895, the Blackfeet land domain had been reduced to what is now the Blackfeet Reservation. And so, when you think about the Blackfeet Reservation, the current boundaries of the Blackfeet Reservation were established in 1895 with the sale of the land that became much of Glacier National Park. So here had previously been the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventre land domain. By 1895, that's what it had been reduced to. The Gros Ventre, in case you're interested, were located onto the Fort Belknap Reservation, along with some Assiniboine bands. And so, this had been the Blackfeet and the Gros Ventre land base as of 1855. By the end of the 19th century, it had been reduced to that and that. Now let's turn quickly to the Crow Indians. There aren't as many to talk about. Well, there are actually a lot, but I'll only talk about a couple. Recall that the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 left the Crow as the occupiers of much of the Yellowstone River drainage. This was Crow land as designated by the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. In the 1860s, the gold rush led to small instances of conflict between Americans and the Crow. At the same time, in the 1860s, the Sioux were encroaching upon Crow lands from the east. So you've got American settlers butting up against Crow lands in the west, the Sioux encroaching upon Crow lands in the east. And so in 1868, the United States called a treaty conference with the Crow. This treaty conference occurred at Fort Laramie. So this is the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty between the United States and the Crow primarily, although the Sioux were involved as well, as you'll learn in just a minute. In the treaty, the federal government promised to provide a long, long list of useful supplies and provisions to the Crow in exchange for the eastern part of the Crow land domain. And so what the Crow gave up in the 1868 treaty was the lands in between the Wolf Mountains and the Powder River. So previously, Crow land had gone to the Powder River, but with the 1868 treaty, the Crow gave up this land here, in between the Wolf Mountains and the Powder River. Anyone want to take a guess as to who that land went to? The Sioux, not Americans. This land didn't go to Americans. There weren't Americans trying to settle there. This land went to the Sioux. The United States wanted to prevent war between the Sioux and the Crow. And so what it did is, rather than have the Crow and the Sioux fight one another for control over that land, it called this treaty conference and effectively accommodated the Sioux's expansionist impulses by pressuring the Crow to give up land to the Sioux in exchange for the annuities. Another significant Crow land cession occurred in 1882. In that year, the federal government pressed the Crow to give up its land at the headwaters of the Yellowstone River, this area right in here, and to accept a 400-foot wide right-of-way through the middle of Crow lands. Why would the federal government want a 400-foot wide right-of-way through Crow lands in 1882?
Railroad.
To make way for the Northern Pacific Railroad. The 1868 and the 1882 land secessions that I briefly described were just two of the land losses suffered by the Crow during this period in time. In my research for this, I found 19 agreements, 19 separate agreements between the federal government and the Crow, in which the Crow were pressured to give up land to the federal government. 19 land cessions during this period in time. The point being is that the federal government taking land away from Montana tribes didn't just sort of happen once. Here you are on your reservation, there you are. It was step by step, bit by bit. One chunk of land here, one chunk of land there, one chunk of land here, one chunk of land there, until finally the Crow Reservation was dwindled down to what it is in the present day. Here's what Crow land was as of 1851. Here's what it was by the end of the century. Now, this map also shows the other tribal reservations that were essentially formed during this period. Fort Peck Reservation, Northern Cheyenne, Crow Reservation, Fort Belknap, and the Blackfeet Reservation. The Rocky Boy Reservation wasn't created until later, which I'll talk about in a later lecture, the 1910s. But the overall point is, here was Montana Indians' land domain as of 1855. That's what it was by the end of the century. And it was a step-by-step process through many, many, many separate land cessions. What were the effects of this land dispossession? The land dispossession caused enormous social and economic hardships for Montana Indians. Once Native Americans had been concentrated onto these smaller reservations, the social and economic conditions became abysmal. Montana Indians suffered from ghastly high rates of disease. Tuberculosis in particular was deadly. Montana Indians suffered from high rates of social disease, such as alcoholism. Most severely, they suffered literally from starvation. I'll give you one example. We've talked a lot about the Blackfeet, and the Blackfeet provide a chilling, chilling example of the malnutrition and starvation that many Montana Indians suffered during this period. Estimates are that somewhere between 1/6 and 1/4 of the Piegan Blackfeet died from starvation in 1883 and 1884. In 1883 and 1884, estimates are that between 1/6 and 1/4 of all Piegan Blackfeet died of starvation. There was a Blackfeet man named Almost a Dog who lived during this period in time, who carved a notch in a wooden rod that he kept for each person that he knew about who died. At the end of this period, he carved 555 notches. I want to explain what the causes of these abysmal social and economic conditions were, but I don't have time to rush through it in 1 minute. So let's stop here. At the beginning of class on Friday, I'll take 5 minutes to explain